Good evening, everybody. So we have a couple of questions that were left over from last month's Q&A that we just didn't have time to get to last month. So we're going to hit those tonight. The first one comes from Daniel 12 and verse 4. So go ahead and turn to Daniel 12, verse 4. You'll remember this is the tail end of the final vision in the book of Daniel. And this is basically Daniel's debriefing at the end of his prophetic ministry. God is wrapping up with him. And let's go ahead and get the end of the vision. We'll start in verse 1 of Daniel 12. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. Then the question comes from verse 4. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. And the question reads, I believe we are in the time of the end. Has there been any evidence that the book, referred to in verse 4, has been unsealed? Have they discovered any relics, scrolls, or manuscripts that point to the unsealed book? New fragments in the Qumran area, or the tabernacle site in Shiloh, or new discoveries and interpretations from old manuscripts like the Codex Sinaiticus, caves or underground vaults from Jerusalem to Rome. And so this gives us a couple of real basic questions that we need to answer first before we get to some of the other questions. The basic questions here, whenever God tells him to shut up and seal the book, well, what book are we talking about? First off. And whenever he says to do that until the time of the end, well, what do we mean by the end? Or when is the end? And I think the question has been built on a couple of assumptions about these questions. And I feel like we need to deal with these first before we can get to the actual question itself about is there any evidence that the book has been unsealed. And we talked about this a little bit whenever we were studying through Daniel a couple of quarters ago, that in our day and age, whenever we read a phrase like the end or the time of the end in Scripture, what time period do we automatically jump to in our minds? If you hear the end, what event do you think of? Just almost automatically. The final judgment. And I think that's where I don't know, maybe we're just conditioned to automatically jump to that point. I want to make the case that that is not what Daniel is talking about. That's not what God is talking about to Daniel. That whenever he's referring to the time of the end, he is not talking about the end of time, like the end of all things, the final judgment. But he is referring to the end of something else, that all of these prophetic visions in the book of Daniel have been pointing forward to all along. And as for the identity of the book, all right, well, let's say that you think that the end is the end of time, the final judgment. Then you could suspect, and I think a lot of the things that are brought up in the question suspect that the book is referring to something that we do not yet have that was written by Daniel, something that we have been waiting to discover because it has been sealed by God and has not been either his only recently been unsealed or has yet to be unsealed, and it's just, it's awaiting our discovery, which is why I think we have questions about things being found in the Qumran caves, the tabernacle site at Shiloh, Codex Sinaiticus, and various other sites ranging all over from Jerusalem to Rome. And I think our understanding of when the end is going to be will influence what our understanding of what the book is. I think there's a really simple answer to what is the book that's being unsealed, and when the unsealing is taking place and what the unsealing is for. In other words, whenever God tells Daniel in verse 4, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end, that's assuming that there's going to be an unsealing. The words have been sealed for a purpose, and at some point there's going to be an unsealing. And figuring out when the end is helps us to identify when the unsealing is. So I want us to just briefly review what we remember from the book of Daniel. All right, Daniel's got 12 chapters. I only want to focus right now on the last 6 of them. Because as we noted over and over, whenever we were studying Daniel's basically split into these 2 parts. The first 6 chapters, the narrative sections, and the last 6 chapters, or the vision section. So it starts with chapter 7, which is the vision of the 4 beasts, which represent 4 kingdoms. And these 4 kingdoms are followed by a 5th kingdom that destroys them, and the 5th kingdom is established forever. Chapter 8 is the vision of the ram and the goat. In which the sacrifice is going to be taken away for 2,300 mornings and evenings, but will eventually be restored. In Daniel chapter 9, besides having Daniel's prayer, like after Daniel's prayer, we get another vision, the vision of the 70 weeks. And then chapters 10 through 12 all go together. It is a very long vision talking about the kings of the north and the south. And in that vision, you've got these 2 heathen kings, the king of the north and the king of the south, and you've got God's people kind of stuck in the middle, suffering the consequences of their war with each other. And eventually the king of the north wins out over the king of the south. And after he wins, he turns his attention to God's people, and he oppresses them mightily by doing things like banning the sacrifice. In fact, I want us to spend a little bit of time talking about all of the things that are in common between all of these visions, these 4 visions. In all of these visions, we see God's people being oppressed by heathen kings. And they are awaiting deliverance from God. In a couple of these visions, the vision of the ram and the goat and the kings of the north and the south, the sacrifice is banned, is taken away for a period of time. In both of these visions, the ram and the goat and the kings of the north and the south, we have this language about sealing up the vision and shutting up the words of the book. And all of these visions are awaiting a time when God's enemies will be judged and destroyed, and God will establish His kingdom on the earth. All right, so let's... and we can start with this one. This one's really obvious. This one kind of lays out the whole scheme of the visionary idea in all of these visions. You have these 4 heathen kingdoms that oppress God's people. The 4th kingdom is the worst of all, and it wears God's people out. But eventually, there's this judgment scene. The Ancient of Days shows up, and he is rendering judgment against these 4 kingdoms. And he gives the kingdom over, the 5th kingdom, he gives over to one like a son of man, who arrives in on a cloud. Excuse me. So the Son of Man shows up, God's people are delivered, and the Son of Man sets up this 5th kingdom, which is an everlasting kingdom. Right, now the rest of these visions follow that same basic pattern. God's people are oppressed. They are awaiting the defeat and the judgment of these heathen kings and the arrival of a Messiah. All right, the vision of the 70 weeks. There's going to be a long period of oppression, at the end of which the Messiah is going to come and deliver His people. All right, the vision of the kings of the north and the south. Again, same basic message. There is going to be this long period of oppression, at the end of which, and we caught the tail end of this. At the end of this, the Messiah is going to come, and God's people are going to be delivered out of the hand of these heathen kings. And the language that we're given here is resurrection language. That's how great the restoration of God's people is going to be in this kingdom that He is going to establish. All right, so I want to consider. As we consider this vision about the 4 beasts and the Son of Man who is given this kingdom that lasts forever, I feel like this is the easiest one for us to interpret. Who's the Son of Man? Jesus. The obvious Bible school answer that's always right. The Son of Man is Jesus. What's His kingdom? The church. This is explicitly a messianic vision that is anticipating God's victory through the crucifixion and the resurrection of His Son and the establishment of His church. All right, so there's going to be this period of time where God's people are oppressed. But at the end of that time, the Messiah, Jesus, is going to come, and He's going to establish His church. Now, we've seen that all of these visions follow the same basic pattern. That, in other words, all of these visions are pointing forward to the same thing. That some of these visions may not explicitly mention the kingdom, the church, in the way that this vision does, but they're all looking forward to deliverance, and they're all looking forward to the Messiah. And those 2 things both point to the establishment of God's kingdom in the church. Not to the final judgment. Nowhere in these visions do we read about the final judgment, as in the return of the Son of God to judge the living and the dead, to either a resurrection of life or a resurrection of death. All of these visions pertain to the first coming of the Son of God. And in some of this language, we can see some pretty clear indications. Like, back in the class, whenever we explained the vision of the 70 weeks, we explained how that's based on the year of, like the Sabbath year and the year of Jubilee. How 70 weeks means 77s. That whenever you look at the Sabbath year commandment, excuse me, and the commandment for the year of Jubilee in Leviticus, the way that Moses describes it is you count off 7 years. All right, and every 7th year you have a Sabbath year, and then he says you count out 7 weeks of years. And that gives you the year of Jubilee. Well, we ended up, and I'm not going to run through all of the math on this. In fact, I want to try not to making this board look like a conspiracy board. You know, like the cork board that's got all the news articles posted on it with, you know, yarn running from pin to pin, and, you know, I've got like my hair spiked up and I look like I haven't slept for 3 days. I'm not going to do that. So we're not going to run through the math again on this. But one of the points that we made whenever we first studied this is that Israel, whenever it first starts out as a kingdom, goes through this faithless period for about 490 years, where they skip the year of Jubilee. They skip the Sabbath years as well. And in Jeremiah and at the beginning of Daniel 9, excuse me, God's people are told that they're going to suffer for 70 years in captivity, 1 year for every year of Sabbath rest that the land didn't get. So 70 Sabbath years that they missed. And this becomes kind of the flip side of that. Whereas there were 70 years for Israel to complete its iniquity, complete its sin, so that God gets fed up with them and kicks them out of the land. Well, there's going to be another period of 70 Sabbath years where God is reestablishing them in the promised land and working on bringing about the Messiah. And you look at that time frame, and that gets you basically up to the time of Jesus. Let's see. In some of these visions, let's point out some specifics here. The struggle here is usually described in terms of these heathen kings standing up against God and against the commandments of God. Like, for instance, and I always forget, in Daniel 11, here we go. Just some examples. Daniel 11, verse 32. Or we could even go a little bit earlier. Let's go to 31. Forces from him, that is this final king of the north who wins out and who's oppressing God's people. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering. And they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. And the wise among the people shall make many understand, though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them with flattery. And some of the wise shall stumble, so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end. For it still awaits the appointed time. And the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers, or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. All right. As we were studying through this, we made the case that the king that's being described here in Daniel chapter 11, in this material, especially in this material that we just read, this final king of the north who wins out over the king of the south and turns his attention to oppressing God's people, that this points specifically to this man named Antiochus IV Epiphanes. The Epiphanes, as we noted, is a nickname. It means God made manifest. Alright, so Antiochus' official nickname, the one that he preferred to go by, was God made manifest. He was one of the first Seleucid kings to mint coinage claiming divinity for himself. So on some of his coinage, he would refer to himself as Theos Epiphanes, where he's made it even more explicit. Epiphanes just means made manifest. The implication is it's God made manifest. Whenever he was minting coins, he made it explicit. He had a portrait of himself put on the coins, and around his portrait, he had the words Theos Epiphanes, God made manifest. Imagine having to use that for money. Imagine if you pull out a quarter and you had George Washington on it, and it said God made manifest around it. That's the way that Antiochus acted. In Babylon, he was commonly referred to as Soter, which means Savior. All right, and there are various other divine titles that he took for himself. He most famously banned Judaism. He banned the worship of Israel's God, and he defiled the temple by setting up an altar to Zeus in the temple. And I was researching this. I learned something that I hadn't known before. The altar that he set up to Zeus, the way he set it up, and he offered a pig as a sacrifice on this altar. So he's defiling the temple. But the way that he set this altar up, he set it in front of a big golden idol of Zeus. And guess who Zeus looked like? Antiochus Epiphanes. Imagine that. That's the way that he commissioned that statue. You're going to build me a golden statue of Zeus that looks just like me. Because Zeus obviously looks like me. So that's... Now you consider that behavior, and then you look at what we just read about this king in chapter 11. He will do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. This is pretty clearly, I think, Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, what that does for us, there's a reason that I bring all of that up. What that does for us is it creates this really interesting effect as we go through the vision section of the book. In chapter 7, we are given 4 kingdoms. Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, and possibly Rome. It's a matter of some debate. Either the beasts are Babylon, Media, Persia, Greece, or they are Babylon and then Medo-Persia is treated as one kingdom. Greece becomes the third, Rome becomes the fourth. But look what happens in chapter 8. We're told explicitly that the 2 beasts represent Medo-Persia as one kingdom, as one empire, and Greece. Alright, notice what's happened. Babylon has been cut out of the picture. So now we started with this broad range of kingdoms, now it's narrowed down. Chapter 9 doesn't talk about any specific kingdoms. so we'll skip that. But chapters 10 through 12 do talk about a specific kingdom, just one specific kingdom. Just Greece. Notice what the vision section is doing. As you go further and further in, the scope is getting more and more narrow. It's like God is honing in on Greece as the big enemy. Now, from what we know from the vision of the four beasts in Daniel chapter 7, what happens after the fourth beast? Who comes after the fourth beast? Jesus does. The Messiah does. He establishes His church. After the fourth beast, it's over. God wins. And then the rest of the book spends its time narrowing down to the big enemy. And after the big enemy is defeated, that is when we read at the beginning of Daniel chapter 12, "At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people. There shall be a time of trouble such as never has been until there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered." In this language of deliverance, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. "And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase." All right. At what point do those who sleep in the dust of the earth awake? Again, sometimes whenever we read about resurrection in the Scripture, we automatically think final resurrection. That's not the only resurrection that happens in the Scripture. What about the arrival of the Messiah? Is there a massive resurrection during Jesus' earthly ministry? Well, yeah. Whenever He's crucified. Remember, the tombs open up. There's this huge resurrection event whenever Jesus is crucified. And then the rest of Daniel, go down to verse 11. "From the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away by Antiochus Epiphanes, by this Greek king, from the time that the burnt offering is taken away and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 1,335 days. But go your way till the end. And you shall rest and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of the days." All right, so when does this deliverance take place? It's in some way tied to the abomination that makes desolate being set up, the regular burnt offering being taken away. In other words, it's tied in some way to the oppressions of Antiochus Epiphanes. That after that, that's when the end comes. That's when God's people will be delivered. And that is when, everybody is rewarded. Excuse me. So over and over and over again, all of these visions are pointing to the arrival of Jesus and the establishment of the church after God has dealt with Antiochus Epiphanes, this Greek king who rules roughly 150 years before Jesus. So after he's done, after this kingdom is over, then the fifth kingdom is set up, and it will never be undone. All right, so if that is the time of the end that God is referring to here in Daniel 12, and I think that is the time of the end, that we're not talking end of the world, we're not talking final judgment, we're talking about the arrival of the Messianic age. That is the end. Whenever Jesus comes and establishes His kingdom. Then the book that is being sealed up All right, whenever God says, "But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end," or whenever he says earlier in chapter 8, something essentially similar, when he says in verse 26, "The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now." The vision that's being referred to, the book that's being referred to in context, is Daniel's book of visions. That's the book that's being sealed. It's not that Daniel has written some separate book that we have no knowledge of, and that has been sealed up and hidden and lost to history. It's that God is telling Daniel, "Look, all of these visions that I gave you, seal them up until the time, until they are needed. And then they will be unsealed." So, the answer to the question is yes, the book has been unsealed. Because that book is at least the last half of the book of Daniel itself. He may be referring to the whole book here. My hunch is that he's just referring to the visions, chapters 7 through 12. I'll get to that hunch in just a second. That's the book that was sealed. That is what has been unsealed. Excuse me. And it served its purpose. Because all of these warnings and all of these encouragements are directed to God's people who were living during the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. They're all relevant to them. And so it would have been unsealed for them. Right, so that's the basic answer. Let me move from that to a big fat speculation. And I cannot emphasize enough that this is speculation that I'm about to share. This is my hypothesis. This is my hunch. This is something that I think fits the evidence, but doesn't have enough evidence to insist that this is the only way to look at things, to call it a thesis or a theory. I want us to consider something. We said over and over and over, there's this huge division between the first 6 chapters, the narrative sections, and the last 6 chapters, the vision section. And it struck people as odd, because whenever you look at the narrative section, chapters 1 through 6 flow chronologically. In chapter 1, Daniel's a very young man. In chapter 6, he is a very old man. And there's the timing goes from point A to point B. The timing's not mixed up. But then, when you go to Daniel chapter 7, look at verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. All of a sudden now we've jumped back in time. So there's some sort of clear division between chapters 6 and 7. This pertained to the story. Now this is about visions that Daniel received. And these chapters, by the way, chapters 7 through 12, they run chronologically relative to each other, but not relative to chapters 1 through 6. So it's like you've got one timeline that goes from chapter 1 through 6, and then it starts over, and a second timeline that runs from 7 through 12. 7 is the first one chronologically that Daniel received, and the final vision, chapters 10 through 12, that's the last one chronologically that he received, the latest dated vision that we have in the book. Now, if you wanted to arrange this whole thing chronologically, you would have to mix the chapters up. So in chapter 8, we're given that it's the 3rd year of Darius. Let's see. I don't know if we're given a date for chapter 6. But if you wanted to rearrange the entire book chronologically, it would look something like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 5, either 6 or 8 and then 6, then 9, and 10 through 12. That's what the book would look like if it was completely chronological. And liberal scholars, Bible scholars that don't believe in God, don't believe in miracles or the supernatural, and frankly, I don't understand why they're Bible scholars. They have, for decades, made all sorts of hay over this. That there's this clear division between these two chunks of the book, and they say we're actually looking at two separate books. One of them possibly written by the historical Daniel. The second one, no way. There's absolutely no way that he wrote that book. Because we know that prophetic visions aren't real. They can't possibly happen. Daniel existed hundreds of years before this stuff would have happened. This was somebody who was writing during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes. That's what must be going on here. And one of the things that they like to cite in support of this is that we really do not have any copies of the book of Daniel. Like we have no way of confirming the existence of the book of Daniel very much before the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. And of course that's something that they trot out and they say, you see, there's no proof that this book actually exists before the events happened. What's going on here is somebody wrote down the events as they happened and just stitched this on to some earlier material, and everybody decided, well, we're just going to call this whole thing Daniel, and we're all going to pretend that Daniel had these prophetic visions. Now, here is my hunch. In a very, very superficial sense, on a couple of points, I think these scholars may be onto something. And let me explain what I mean, because I'm no skeptic. I think that Daniel wrote the whole thing. Let me just get that out of the way. But let me share this hunch with you. This is a big fat what if. If this vision section is supposed to be sealed up, like God instructed in chapters 8 and 12, my hunch is that what happened is that Daniel actually wrote two separate scrolls. He wrote one scroll with the narrative section, telling his life story. He wrote a second scroll containing all of the visions that he had received from God. The first scroll was just made available. And for whatever reason, we haven't found copies of it. The second scroll was sealed up like God instructed, and was lost to history until the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, during which it was discovered by God's providence, unsealed, and made available to the people who needed it. That the people who lived hundreds of years after Daniel were intended to be his primary audience. And so God had him seal up the vision so that they could receive it. Because in God's estimation there was no need for earlier people to receive the vision. So it explains why you have this division between the first half and the second half, why you've got a chronological order here and a chronological order here, and it makes sense of the sealing and the unsealing. But, like I said, that's just my hunch. So, alright. As for Qumran, Shiloh, Codex Sinaiticus, underground vaults, any sort of archaeological evidence that there is some formerly undiscovered prophecy, we've not found anything to that effect. So, looking into the material that we found, there's not anything new. That's actually part of why the Dead Sea Scrolls are such a big deal. Like, you find a lot of scrolls dealing with like the rules for the community that made those scrolls. But otherwise, by and large, what you're finding is just copies of the Hebrew Old Testament. You're finding copies of the Old Testament books, including the oldest, nearly complete copy of the Isaiah scroll that we have. That's part of what's amazing about the Dead Sea Scrolls, is that you're just finding the Old Testament, by and large. All right, so I know that was kind of a big question that kind of wandered all over the last half of the book of Daniel. So any questions about that or comments on the end time as it's written about in Daniel, or the sealing and the unsealing, anything that we've discussed? Wayne.
I heard something over the book.
Mm-hmm.
I was taught in part of college that it was having to do with the prophecy of the coming church.
Mm-hmm.
After 70 AD, that the setting up of the abomination was what Jesus prophesied was going to happen later. And that would be the sign for the disciples to let out across the rooftops to escape the Romans who were coming in to destroy Jerusalem.
Yeah.
This was what he brought up.
Was the abomination of desolation. Yeah.
Now, I was not taught this.
Mm-hmm.
However, this is very interesting to me because it could be, I don't want to, well, for lack of any other explanation, it could be more than one place or more than one interpretation of this, or application, I guess you would say.
Yeah, application I think would be better. And we should note, because Jesus obviously picks up this language from Daniel. He cites Daniel explicitly. And then John, in writing Revelation, also borrows a lot of this imagery, especially the bits about these kings, these emperors, who make themselves out to be God. And here's the thing, Antiochus Epiphanes is the first of the Seleucid kings to do this, but he's not the last Greco-Roman ruler to make himself out to be God, or to mint coins calling himself God. There was, all right, just pop quiz. The 7 churches that received the book of Revelation, where were they all located? What Roman province? Asia. In Asia, in the Roman province of Asia, there was a really active emperor cult. That they were pagans. This didn't happen officially in Rome. This isn't something that the emperor did himself. But in Asia Minor, there was a very strong cult, heathens who worshipped the emperor as God. All right, now eventually over the course of time, this ends up going into mainstream Roman society. And you can go to Rome and you can see images of the apotheosis of different Caesars, meaning they're becoming God, they're turning into God upon their death. But it starts in Asia, where these cultists referred to the emperor as Theos Pantocrator, God Almighty, which is exactly the same sort of language that the New Testament uses to describe the true and living God. Pantocrator is used all the time to describe God and to describe Jesus, all-powerful or almighty. Some of the emperors were described as Huios Theou, Son of God. All right. Obviously, the New Testament takes issue with that, right? But this is a pattern that we do see continue. It starts with Antiochus, but it continues into Roman history. So, I think it's possible there might be some intention of having a broader or multiplied application to it. Since you bring that up, Wayne.
We were talking about Eusebius and his revelation of is talking about citing old historians who talked about the old false teachers and false teachings and things. And one of them was Magnus, who was
Right. Simon the Great.
He just like Antiochus Epiphanes, he set up
he set up a cult for himself. I forgot about that.
himself.
Yeah.
And referred to himself as the Almighty God, you know. That was his thing. And so I'm thinking here that this could be a setup or a policy of something like that. Then you can make it apply to Rome and to Paul teachers and to others, even beyond that.
Yeah. So I suspect, because we do have, we have copies of Daniel dating from around the time of Antiochus. So my gut feeling is that he is the primary target of that prophecy. That it was around for people to read because they were being oppressed by him. So, but multiple application, I think, is, when you're looking at the apocalyptic literature, I think you definitely have to be open to that. So, excellent point. All right. The second question tonight is, we say that the five first books of the Bible were written by Moses. And I don't know where that started. It seems instead that some later scribe is recounting history, especially in chapter 34 of Deuteronomy. Moses could not have written that in the tense it is written about his own death. It would have read more like a prophecy of a future event, not as one which happened many years before. I think we need to stop copycatting other religions and what they believe and look at the Scriptures themselves and be more open to seeing what the Scriptures actually say, not what other religions tell us they say. So, let's start with the kind of the obvious point, I guess, that, it doesn't seem like Moses is writing about his own death. If you really wanted to make the argument, I think it'd be a stretch, but you could say that Moses is writing proleptically, meaning he's writing about something that hasn't happened, as if it has already happened, and that he writes about his own death in that way before he dies, just knowing that he's going to die. I don't suspect that that's the case. I think that probably some of the things that are written about Moses probably came in from a later hand, particularly the thing about his death. But I want us to just go through briefly, and I want to provide a simple answer to this. There's a more complex answer that I could give, but we probably want to eat supper sometime and then go to bed. So, let me give the simple answer. Because here, the basic issue is if you read through the law of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, Moses does not explicitly identify himself as the author of the Torah. For that matter, the author does not identify himself at all. Nowhere are we told, Moses to the congregation of Israel, or I, Moses, wrote this with my own hand. We're never given that. The author never identifies himself. And Moses, as he appears in the text, Moses is always written of in the third person. It's not like in Acts, whenever Luke was actually with Paul, because he starts writing in the first person plural. We started doing this. Moses is not written of that way. He doesn't say, I took the stone tablets and smashed them. Yes, Moses took the stone tablets and smashed them. What I want to focus on in giving a simple answer to this is that I think that we should refer to the law of Moses as the law of Moses, because that's what Jesus refers to it as. And we'll just look at a few texts. Matthew chapter 8 and verse 1. When he came down from the mountain, great crowds followed him. And behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will be clean. And immediately his leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer the gift that Moses commanded for a proof to them. Now, I'll give you a guess. You got a 1 in 5 chance of this. The relevant law has to do with cleanliness, with cleansing from leprosy, and going to show yourself to a priest to prove that you've been cleansed from leprosy. What book of the Torah does that appear in? If you had to guess. Cleanliness. It's Leviticus. If it's cleanliness, it's Leviticus. Alright, so Jesus explicitly identifies the cleanliness laws in Leviticus as coming from Moses. Alright, so let's keep a record of this. How much Alright, so we've got Leviticus. Jesus is referred to that as Moses. Chapter 19, Matthew chapter 19. Starting in verse 3. And Pharisees came up to him and tested him by asking, Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? He answered, Have you not read that he who created them from the beginning made them male and female? And he said, Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. Now notice here, Jesus has already referred to the text of Genesis. He's not explicitly identified an author, though. So we'll pass on that. But they said to him, Why then did Moses command one to give a certificate of divorce and to send her away? He said to them, Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery. Okay? So, again, he has appealed to Genesis, but he has explicitly referred to a section of the law as Moses. Because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives. And he's responding particularly to this commandment about giving a certificate of divorce to send her away. And Keith, you just taught about this recently. Do you remember where this comes from in the law of Moses? That the certificate of divorce, does anybody remember where that is? What book that's in the law of Moses? Deuteronomy. Alright? So he has explicitly called out Deuteronomy and possibly Genesis. Let's see. Let's go to Mark chapter 7. Mark chapter 7, verse 9. He said to them, You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, Honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. All right, where do we read, You must honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die? Exodus. We read that. That's one of the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20. And then the command that whoever reviles father or mother must surely die is in Exodus chapter 21. All right. Now, in my search, I did not find an explicit reference to the laws written in the book of Numbers as Moses, but we do have a couple of other things that we can look at. Let's see. No, that can't be right. Oh, that's John 7, sorry. Let me pick one out here just so that we're not reading all of the scripture references that I wrote down. Let's test this one out. Okay, this is a good generic one. John chapter 7. Start in verse 14. John 7:14. About the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, "How is it that this man has learning when he has never studied?" So Jesus answered them, "My teaching is not mine." We just went over this morning. "My teaching is not mine, but His who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory. But the one who seeks the glory of Him who sent him is true, and in Him there is no falsehood. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me?" But notice the way he's referred to it. Has not Moses given you the law? Just generic, the whole thing. All right. And similarly, in Luke chapter 16, in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, remember at the end, the rich man asks Abraham to send Lazarus back as a ghost to visit his brothers. You remember what Abraham tells the rich man? He says, he doesn't say the law and the prophets. Abraham says, they have Moses and the prophets, referring to the law by synecdoche. So we have explicit references, at least to Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Exodus. We have an implied reference to Genesis. And then we have we have a couple of broad references to the whole law as being from Moses. So, let's grant Moses does not identify himself as the author, and there are parts of the narrative that seem really odd to say that they were written by Moses, like his own death. But otherwise, Jesus is consistent in referring to the law as Moses. And if the Jews were wrong on this point, and it mattered, Jesus would have known and would have said something. Does that make sense? I guess maybe you could say that, maybe Jesus knew that they were wrong but just didn't correct them. But then the point comes to, then apparently it doesn't matter that we call it Moses. So, by example, we ought to be calling it the law of Moses. That's the simple answer. All right. Any questions or comments? Wayne.
When we refer to it as the law of Moses, that's well within the Scripture.
Yeah.
When we start talking about it as He wrote the books, and implicitly implied that what we have today was from His hand. You see what I'm saying? Then, because it's just like the Dead Sea Scrolls. They have been rewritten and rewritten for years and years and years. We don't have the original documents from that time.
Yeah.
So
if it's a text, sorry, go ahead. You finish.
When you talk about it as being written, Moses, it came from Moses, yes. But it's I guess just neither here nor there. It's just kind of twiddly-dee, twiddly-dum. I'm just thinking we're calling it something that it's not, because if it wasn't for precisely written by Moses himself.
Mm-hmm.
It was given by God to Moses, who then gave it to the Israelites,
Mm-hmm.
and they wrote it down.
Mm-hmm.
So, even though it is a law of Moses, it is
Mm-hmm.
from Moses.
Yeah. So if we want to treat it as what we might call a text critical question, where what we have is not what was written by the hand of Moses himself, but by a scribe copying down. That's true of literally every book of the Bible. But we don't, whenever we read the epistles, we don't have any hang-up about saying that we're reading Paul, even though we don't have any of the original Greek manuscripts of the epistles that Paul would have written with his own hand. First off, those don't exist because we know that Paul didn't write. He hired what you call an amanuensis, somebody that you can dictate to. Remember at the end, which epistle is it? At the end of at least one of his epistles, he writes, I, Paul, write this with my own hand. In other words, he's saying literally that sentence. I, Paul, write this with my own hand. That is written in Paul's own hand. That's like his signature. If you were looking at the original, you could see the change in handwriting. There's in one of his epistles he refers to, I think, Silvanus. Silvanus I think actually writes, I, Silvanus, who wrote this letter, greet you. And I forget at the end of which of Paul's epistles that is. But we know that Paul used Silvanus, and possibly a few other individuals, to dictate to. His hand didn't write these letters, but we don't have any problem calling them the epistles of Paul. Even though the originals weren't written by him, and we don't have the originals, we just have copies. But it just comes back around to the way that Jesus talks about it. Like, if there's a distinction to be made there between copies written by Moses' own hand and later scribal copies that we have possession of, or even if we were trying to draw a distinction between the law of Moses on the one hand and on the other hand the books which contain those laws, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, if we were trying to somehow distinguish those two things as separate, Jesus doesn't draw that distinction. He doesn't draw that distinction in either sense, either in terms of the manuscript history or in terms of the laws versus the books that they're contained in. So that one, again, if Jesus doesn't make a big deal out of it, I'm not inclined to make a big deal out of it, if that makes sense. So, all right. Good question. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well, thank you again for the questions this month. Definitely keep them coming. Excuse me. So I like digging into some of these issues that require a little more digging around, a little more thought, connecting some dots a little bit. Sometimes there is an inner conspiracy theorist in me that likes to be let loose and start drawing connections between things. I try to keep them reined in most of the time. So, go ahead and take out your songbooks. Dennis has selected number 814, Are You Washed in the Blood? As we know, salvation only comes through the blood of Jesus. One can only come to the Father through Jesus. And so the question is, are you loyal to Jesus? Have you pledged your loyalty to Him by repenting of your sins, confessing Him as Lord, and being baptized into His death, burial, and resurrection? And have you maintained that loyalty, that faith, that faithfulness? Or are you in need of restoration? Or are you in need of prayer? Are you struggling with something that you want to make known and have the congregation praying for you on? We are witness to the power of that. If you have any of those needs, we invite you to make them known by coming forward as together we stand and sing.